The world rarely changes in one dramatic explosion. More often, it shifts quietly. In spreadsheets, in supply chains, in decisions most people never see. As 2026 approaches, the global order is not collapsing. It is rearranging along 5 invisible fault lines that will shape how you live, how much you pay, and how safe the world really is. China controls the minerals that power your phone, your car, your grid. Tariffs meant to protect nations are quietly landing on consumers like you. The last guardrails on nuclear weapons are about to disappear. A new kind of energy superpower, the Electrostate, is rising in plain sight. And millions of women are paying the price for a world pulling back from responsibility. These are not separate stories. They are one system, moving at speed. If you want to understand the forces shaping 2026 before they hit your life, stay with me. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And the next step is understanding the problem we're actually facing. At first glance, these 5 trends look disconnected. Minerals, tariffs, nuclear treaties, energy transitions, humanitarian aid. But global politics today no longer runs on isolated events. It runs on interdependence. The same supply chains that determine who controls lithium and cobalt also decide who absorbs tariff shocks. The same strategic rivalry pushing nations to hoard minerals is eroding trust in arms control. The same budget pressures that justify tariffs and industrial policy are being used to slash foreign aid. And the same country, China, sits at the center of each shift, not by accident, but by design. This is the real story of 2026. A world moving from cooperation to competition, from openness to leverage, from shared rules to fragmented power. Governments call this national security. Markets feel it as volatility, and ordinary people experience it as higher prices, higher risks, and fewer safety nets. To understand where this system is going, we have to understand how it was built. And that means going back to where these pressures began. That story starts with the quiet race beneath the surface of the global economy. To understand why 2026 feels so unstable, you have to look beneath headlines and elections into the architecture of the global economy. For decades, efficiency was the organizing principle. Countries specialized, supply chains stretched across continents, costs fell, dependence grew. Nowhere was this more pronounced than in critical minerals, the building blocks of modern power. Cobalt, rare earths, lithium, essential for defense systems, electric vehicles, power grids, and advanced electronics. The problem wasn't ignorance. It was optimism. The world assumed that markets would remain open and geopolitics would stay secondary. China used that assumption to build dominance not just in mining, but in processing, refining, and the technologies that sit in between. By the time vulnerability became obvious, concentration was extreme. One country controlled extraction in some cases, processing in most, and price leverage in nearly all. As demand surged, projected to rise sharply by 2030, the old system cracked. What once looked like efficiency began to look like exposure. And exposure in geopolitics invites pressure. That pressure is what finally turned quiet dependence into open crisis. The first shock arrived not with a war, but with a policy decision. The turning point came without tanks or missiles. It came with export controls. In October, China unveiled a new regime that went far beyond restricting raw minerals. It reached into processing technology, into related components, most critically, into rare earth magnets, small objects with outsized power over modern industry. The impact was immediate. These magnets are essential for electric motors, wind turbines, defense systems, and advanced manufacturing. By tightening access, Beijing demonstrated something far more consequential than market strength: coercive capability. Entire segments of the global economy were suddenly exposed. Not hypothetically. Operationally, the message was unmistakable. Dependence could be activated, leverage could be pulled. For Washington, this was no longer a theoretical risk discussed in policy papers. It was a live vulnerability, one that could freeze production lines, spike prices, and compromise national security at speed. This is why the response that followed was not incremental. It was systemic. If you're trying to understand why industrial policy has returned with such force, this is the moment to watch closely. Because the reaction to this shock reshaped far more than mineral markets. It reshaped how the United States now thinks about power itself. What followed was not a single policy, but a new operating model. Faced with concentrated risk, the United States turned to a more muscular form of industrial policy, one that blends markets with state power. Executive orders unlocked tools that had long existed but rarely used at scale. Loans and loan guarantees reduced private risk. Equity and quasi-equity investments aligned public and corporate incentives. Price floors and long-term purchase agreements stabilized future supply. The goal was simple but ambitious. Reduce dependence on China without triggering economic shock. At the same time, Washington moved outward. Bilateral and multilateral agreements sought to diversify supply, align standards, and coordinate financing. The G7, the Quad, Asian partners committing billions to production, processing, and stockpiling. On paper, this looks like resilience. In practice, it is a race against time. Supply chains do not rewire overnight. Mines take years. Processing capacity takes longer, and geopolitics does not pause while infrastructure catches up. That is why uncertainty still dominates the outlook for 2026. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening at once, under pressure. And that pressure doesn't stop at minerals. It spills into trade, into prices, into your daily costs. The next shock made that painfully clear. The second shock didn't arrive through diplomacy. It arrived at the checkout counter. When tariffs were announced, many believed they were leveraged, temporary, reversible, strategic. At first, they were absorbed quietly. Importers leaned on inventories. Retailers held prices steady. Consumers barely noticed. But systems adjust. By October, the burden had shifted decisively. Importers found alternatives. Trade frameworks signaled permanence. And costs began flowing downstream. More than half of tariff costs landed not on foreign exporters, but on US consumers. Prices rose slowly, then steadily, just enough to blend into inflation data, but not enough to escape notice. This is how economic pressure really works. Not as a shock wave, but as accumulation. By mid-2026, the trend points further in the same direction. Consumers are expected to shoulder roughly 2/3 of the burden, not because policy failed, but because it worked exactly as designed. Tariffs became a structural feature, not a negotiating tool. And once that line was crossed, the risk profile changed. Higher prices, slower growth, and the looming possibility of something far worse than inflation alone. To see the real consequences, you have to look away from markets and toward people. Now let's step away from charts and policy and look at you. Because when systems shift, they don't hit everyone equally. They land hardest on those with the least room to absorb shock. You feel it when prices rise, but wages don't. When essentials quietly cost more. When uncertainty replaces stability. But beyond your daily life, the human cost is far more severe. As governments tighten budgets in the name of security and competitiveness, foreign aid has been slashed. And the burden falls overwhelmingly on women. In conflict zones, women rely on aid not as a supplement, but as survival. Food, healthcare, protection. Cuts have already meant more hunger, more displacement, more forced choices. Millions of women losing access to family planning. Girls being married off to keep families alive. Lives shortened not by war alone, but by abandonment. This is what geopolitical trade-offs look like at ground level. invisible in policy debates, devastating in reality. If you've ever wondered whether global decisions matter to real people, this is your answer. And the effects don't stop at borders. They ripple outward, reshaping the world's balance of power. When you pull back and look globally, these shifts begin to align into a single pattern. As the United States hardens its economic defenses, others adjust in response. Supply chains fragment, alliances deepen in some places and strain in others. China, meanwhile, accelerates along a different trajectory. Its dominance in minerals feeds its dominance in manufacturing. That manufacturing feeds exports, and those exports are increasingly electrical. Solar panels, electric vehicles, batteries. For many countries, especially in the developing world, this is not a threat, it's an opportunity. Cheap Chinese technology reduces dependence on imported fuel. Energy security improves without waiting decades for oil or gas infrastructure. This is how the electrostate spreads, not through coercion, but through affordability. At the same time, nuclear stability erodes quietly. With arms control frameworks collapsing, transparency disappears. Limits vanish, incentives to deploy grow. Major powers respond not with restraint, but with hedging. More weapons, faster readiness, higher risk. The result is a world less predictable, more tightly wound, and more exposed to cascading failure. And when systems reach this stage, the future rarely follows a single path. It branches. The question is which branch we're heading toward. Looking toward 2026, the system now in motion points to three possible futures. The first is cautious stabilization. Supply chains slowly diversify. Tariffs stop rising. Arms control doesn't recover, but escalation is managed. The electrostate expands, but dependence is spread across more players. This is not a return to the old order. It is a fragile equilibrium tense, but survivable. The second is managed fragmentation. Economic blocks harden. Prices stay higher. Consumers adapt downward. Nuclear arsenals grow quietly, just short of crisis. Aid remains constrained, and humanitarian damage becomes normalized. The system doesn't collapse, but it becomes colder, narrower, and less forgiving. The third is breakdown. Tariffs fuel stagflation. Strategic minerals become choke points. Nuclear deployments accelerate without transparency. Aid collapses across donors. Shocks stop being absorbed and start compounding. What determines which future arrives is not a single decision. It's coordination, trust, and whether leaders treat interdependence as something to manage or something to weaponize. History shows that systems rarely fail from one blow. They fail from accumulated strain. We are now deep into that accumulation phase, which makes the final question unavoidable. What do we do with this knowledge? The most dangerous illusion in global politics is the belief that systems drift on their own. They don't. They are pushed by incentives, by fear, by short-term fixes that quietly reshape the long term. What you're seeing as 2026 approaches is not chaos. It is design under pressure. Tariffs that promise protection are redistributing pain. Mineral security is being bought with time, not certainty. Nuclear stability is fading without a single treaty being replaced. The electrostate is rising because electricity travels cheaper than trust. And women are absorbing the costs of a world choosing inwardness over responsibility. None of this is inevitable. Every trend described here is man-made, which means it can be unmade, but only if it's understood. That's why analysis matters. Not to predict the future, but to widen the space of choice. If this helped you see the system more clearly, share it, because awareness spreads faster than policy and sometimes faster than crisis. In the next video, we'll go deeper into one of these fault lines and what happens if it snaps. Until then, remember this. The future doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives decision by decision.